"Hey, honey, you thought you buried me, but I'm still here." The words echoed in his mind as he stood motionless at the door, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes wide with disbelief, couldn't process what he was seeing. Sophie, the woman he had buried, the woman he had killed 15 years ago, was standing there on his doorstep. Alive, real, unforgiving. Alex's breath hitched, and a cold sweat formed on the back of his neck. His legs trembled as if his body had forgotten how to move, how to function. His hands, once steady, were now shaking uncontrollably. He wanted to speak, to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. He didn't even know what to say. But before he could say anything, Sophie spoke again, her voice as calm as it was chilling. "I've come for you," she said. Alex stood in the doorway, his mind trying to make sense of the impossible. He could still hear the familiar sound of the morning birds outside. The sun was rising slowly over the quiet streets of Willow Creek, casting a soft golden light on the row of houses that lined the neighborhood. Everything looked the same as it always did, peaceful, normal. But Alex knew that peace was nothing more than an illusion. The calm before the storm. He stepped back, his legs weak, his head spinning. Behind him, his wife, Laura, was still in the kitchen, the clinking of dishes filling the air. She was preparing breakfast, like she always did on Saturday mornings. Pancakes and eggs, the scent of coffee drifting into the living room, a faint hum of a popular morning radio show in the background. The normalcy of the moment should have been comforting, but it only made Alex feel more isolated, more out of place. The door was still slightly ajar, but all he could focus on was the woman standing in front of him. Sophie. She hadn't changed. A bit. Her hair, long and dark, hung loosely around her shoulders. Her face, though weathered by time, still carried that same haunting beauty that had once consumed him. Her eyes, though those were the eyes that he'd buried. Those were the eyes that haunted him, that had never stopped following him. No matter how far he ran, Alex forced himself to close the door behind him, hoping the world would somehow return to its previous state, calm, predictable, safe. He stood there for a moment, trying to gather himself, trying to steady his breath. He could hear his pulse in his ears, thudding with a rhythm that felt far too fast, far too frantic for the calm suburban morning he was supposed to be enjoying. Laura's voice broke through the silence, her cheerful tone a stark contrast to the storm inside Alex's mind. "Alex? Who was that? Wasn't expecting anyone, are we?" Alex didn't answer right away. He couldn't. His mind was racing, his thoughts scattered like leaves in a gust of wind. He thought he had escaped it all. He had rebuilt his life from the wreckage of his past. He had put the lies to rest, buried them deep, sealed them away, convinced that no one would ever uncover the truth. But now, Sophie was standing at his doorstep, her presence shattering everything he had worked so hard to bury. He turned to face Laura, forcing a smile, trying to appear calm. But his eyes were wild, filled with a panic he couldn't contain. "Just an old acquaintance," Alex said, his voice shaky, more strained than he intended. "Nothing to worry about." But his words felt hollow, even to him. Laura stared at him, a look of confusion on her face as she stepped toward the door, her eyes darting from him to the empty space beyond. "Who?" she asked again, a little more insistent. "Who was that, Alex?" He shook his head, his hand trembling as he gestured to the window. "I don't know. Someone from the past. I'll go talk to them. You don't need to worry about it." Laura's brow furrowed in concern. She didn't know about the past, the life Alex had left behind. She only knew the man she had married, the man who smiled at her over breakfast, and helped raise their son, Noah. But now, standing in front of her, was the same man who had once buried a woman Sophie's lifeless body in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the world. The same man who had told everyone she was gone forever. He turned back toward the door, his hand on the handle, but he didn't open it. Not yet. Something about the air felt wrong, like the calm before a storm, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had done, everything he had buried, was about to resurface. His life had been quiet for too long. It had been so normal, so peaceful, and now Sophie was back. The woman he thought he had gotten rid of. The woman he had tried to forget. Alex closed his eyes, just for a moment, trying to steady himself. He tried to block out the noise, the quiet hum of life around him, the bustling town outside his window, the sound of his family carrying on like everything was just as it should be. But inside, everything was falling apart. Every crack in his facade was beginning to show. And in that moment, as he stood there frozen, the past seemed to rise up around him like a dark tide, threatening to pull him under. He could feel it, deep in his chest, the suffocating pressure of the lie he had lived for so long. As Alex finally opened the door, he tried to steady his hands, but they betrayed him. They shook with the memory of the past, the weight of the secrets he'd kept buried for so long. But when he saw Sophie again, all the years of pretending, all the layers of lies he'd wrapped around himself, suddenly seemed fragile like glass on the verge of shattering. He forced himself to look at her, at the woman who had once been his everything and who he had killed, buried, and erased from his life. Her eyes were no longer the eyes of the woman he had known. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the darkness and survived it. And now, she was back. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone spoke volumes. Every detail about her, the way she stood, the way she held herself, told him that Sophie had changed. She wasn't the girl he had once loved. She wasn't the girl he had buried. She was someone else now. Someone stronger, someone far more terrifying. The room seemed to close in on Alex as his heart pounded. The air was thick, suffocating. He could feel his stomach twist into knots. His throat tightened, making it almost impossible to swallow. The past had come knocking. And this time, it wasn't leaving. The house was too quiet. Alex stood in the hallway, trying to steady his breath. His hand was still on the doorknob, his body frozen in place. It didn't make sense. He'd seen her dead. He had buried her. He had buried the past, the guilt, and the lies deep in the woods, far away from anyone who could question him. But now she was here, standing just beyond the door. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. A sharp knock broke through the silence, the sound like a hammer crashing through the fragile shell of the life he had so carefully built. The knock came again, steady and firm, followed by a long, eerie pause. Alex's hand tightened around the knob, but he didn't open it. Not yet. A strange, cold feeling crawled up his spine, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He swallowed hard, the dry lump in his throat making it impossible to speak. His eyes darted around the hallway, as if the walls themselves would offer him an escape. His legs felt like they had turned to lead, unwilling to move, as if the house itself was holding him in place. Another knock. Louder this time, more insistent. Alex's breath hitched. He finally stepped back, away from the door, the room closing in around him. His palms were slick with sweat, his mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once. Was he imagining this? Had he finally lost his grip on reality after all these years? It couldn't be her. She was dead, gone, buried, but everything in his body told him otherwise. A chill ran through him as his pulse quickened. He turned slowly, his legs trembling beneath him as if they had turned to jelly. The house, once filled with the comforting hum of a family living their simple life, now felt oppressive, suffocating. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the pancakes Lavra had made. The radio still played in the background, but it all seemed too loud, too bright, too real. The air was thick with tension. Alex had never forgotten that night. It had been the beginning of everything, the beginning of the lies, the beginning of the end. The night everything in his life shifted from something ordinary to something dark, something he could never escape. The house was quiet, too quiet. The flickering light from the television barely illuminated the living room. Sophie had been pacing back and forth, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence. Her usually warm face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of frustration and hurt. Alex could hear the anger in her voice, feel the sharpness in the words she threw at him. "You've been acting strange." "Alex," Sophie had said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know what's going on with you. I feel like I'm losing you." Alex had sat on the couch, his fingers pressed against the glass of his whiskey tumbler, his gaze fixed on the floor. He had barely heard her words. His mind was clouded, his thoughts scattered like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. His life had felt out of his control for weeks of feeling suffocated by responsibilities, by guilt, by a creeping sense that he was being watched. But it wasn't just that. Sophie's constant questioning, her probing, had started to break him down. "I'm fine," he had said, his voice low, not quite convincing, even to himself. Sophie's eyes had narrowed, her chest rising and falling. With each breath, the anger that simmered inside her had finally boiled over, and she had stood in front of him, blocking his view of the TV, demanding his attention. "Don't lie to me," she snapped. "What the hell is going on, Alex? You've been distant for months. You're hiding something." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. The truth was coming out, but Alex wasn't ready for it. He wasn't ready to face the fact that everything was falling apart. He wasn't ready for the unraveling of the twisted knot he'd created. But Sophie wasn't letting it go. She never did. "Maybe I'm just tired," Alex muttered, trying to deflect her questions, trying to bury the growing panic that gripped his chest. But Sophie wasn't having it. She was too smart, too perceptive. She had always been able to see right through him, even when he thought he could hide his darkest secrets. She could see the cracks forming in their relationship, and she wasn't afraid to call him out on them. "Stop it, Alex. Just stop pretending. I know something's wrong. What are you hiding? What aren't you telling me?" The words stabbed at him, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. The weight of the past few weeks, the weight of his lies, crashed down on him all at once. He could feel the walls closing in. His hands gripped the whiskey tumbler tighter, knuckles turning white. He had never wanted to hurt her. He had loved Sophie truly. But in that moment, he was consumed by something else. A broken resolve, a pressure he couldn't escape. He needed her to stop asking questions. He needed her to stop digging. He needed her to stop being so damn perceptive. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but it wasn't just anger, it was fear. Fear of being exposed. Fear of losing control. "I'm not hiding anything," he had shouted, his voice louder than he intended. His heart was racing now, each beat feeling like a hammer against his ribs. "Why can't you just leave it alone? Why can't you trust me?" Sophie had taken a step back, her expression softening for a moment, but there was still hurt in her eyes. She hadn't expected him to yell. She hadn't expected the rage to spill out like that. "You're scaring me, Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening to you?" But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Alex was no longer the man he'd been a few months ago. The man who could take a deep breath and move through life without feeling the crushing weight of tough secrets. "I said I'm fine," Alex had shouted again, standing up now, his hands trembling as he reached for his glass. "Just leave me alone, Sophie. You wouldn't understand." But Sophie hadn't left. She had stepped closer, and that's when it happened. She had reached out to him, placing a trembling hand on his arm, and in that moment, everything in Alex snapped. The fear, the panic, the overwhelming sense of losing control, everything exploded inside him. Without thinking, he shoved her away. Sophie had fallen backward, her body hitting the edge of the coffee table with a sickening thud. Alex had stood over her, frozen in shock, his mind scrambling to catch up with his actions. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but the rage had taken over. The overwhelming need to make everything stop had consumed him. Sophie had looked up at him from the floor, her hand pressed to her side. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief, and her lips trembled as she tried to speak. "Alex, why?" she had whispered, but Alex couldn't answer her. He couldn't find the words to explain. He couldn't find the words to say he was sorry. He couldn't find the words to take back what he had just done. Sophie's body had gone still. She had stopped moving, and for a long, agonizing moment, Alex had stood there, staring at her, waiting for some sign, some movement, anything that would tell him she was still alive. But there was nothing. His breath had come in short, shallow gasps, his chest tight with fear. He had bent down, desperate to check her pulse, but he already knew. He could feel it. He could feel the weight of what he had done. Sophie was gone. Panic had surged through him in an instant. His hands had trembled. As he reached for her, his mind spiraling. What was he supposed to do now? How could he fix this? There was no fixing it. The moment the violence had erupted, the moment he had pushed her, everything had changed. The next few hours were a blur of frantic decisions. Alex had done the only thing he could think of. He had hidden the evidence. He had dragged Sophie's lifeless body to the garage, his mind clouded with fear and guilt. He had wrapped her in a tarp, his hands shaking, his heart racing. He had to act fast. He had to cover his tracks. But there was no undoing what he had done. He had driven her body into the woods, far from the town, far from the eyes of anyone who could stop him. The moonlight filtered through the trees as he dug, his hands sore from the shovel, his body trembling with exhaustion. The earth had been soft that night, the soil yielding to his efforts. He had buried her quickly, hurriedly, as if the faster he did it, the more he could distance himself from the act. But as the dirt had settled over her, he had felt a weight on his chest that would never lift. The reality of what he had done. The life he had stolen sank deep into his bones. The aftermath had been quick. Alex had returned home, washed the dirt from his hands, and sat in the living room like nothing had happened. But deep down, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The guilt gnawed at him every day, but he buried it just like he had buried Sophie. He buried it with more lies, with more secrets, with more years of pretending. For a decade, Alex had lived in the shadow of his crime. The lie had grown, festered, and twisted itself into the fabric of his life. But now, Sophie had returned. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a memory. She was alive, and she was standing at his doorstep, ready to reveal the truth. The past was no longer buried. It had come back to haunt him, and this time there was nowhere to hide. The door had barely clicked shut behind them before the tension inside. The house was unbearable. Alex's mind was still reeling, trying to process what had just happened. Sophie, the woman he had killed, the woman he had buried, was standing in his living room alive. And now she was waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to answer the questions that had haunted him for so many years. He couldn't breathe. Sophie stood, a few feet away, her eyes locked onto his unwavering cold. There was no anger in her expression, not yet. But there was a deep sadness, something far more painful than the rage Alex had expected. It was like she could see through him, through all the lies, all the defenses he had built. She knew who he was. And now, she was here to make him face it. Her voice was quiet, but firm, cutting through the silence. Why, Alex? Why did you do it? Alex flinched, as if she had struck him. The question was simple, but it hit him like a physical blow. His stomach churned, and his mouth went dry. He had no answers, no explanation that could make sense of what he had done. The words stuck in his throat, choking him. Sophie's gaze didn't waver. She stepped closer, her presence filling the room, pressing in on him like the walls themselves had closed in. You thought you could get away with it, she continued, her voice trembling slightly, but her eyes hard. You thought you could kill me and just move on with your life. What kind of man does that, Alex? What kind of person kills someone they once loved and buries them like they're nothing? The words hung in the air, and Alex felt his heart sinking into his chest. He wanted to say something, anything to explain, but there were no words that could justify what he had done. There was no way to explain the overwhelming fear, the panic, the twisted relief he had felt when Sophie had stopped breathing, when her body had gone still, when he had thought it was all over. But it wasn't over. She was standing here, demanding answers. Alex tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. I didn't know what to do, he said, his voice breaking. You were out of control. You were going to ruin everything, Sophie. I couldn't let that happen. Sophie's face hardened, her jaw tightening as she took another step forward. The air between them crackled with the electricity of unsaid words, of years of silence, of a past that had never really been buried. Ruin everything? You thought I was going to ruin you? What about me, Alex? What about what you did to me? What you took from me? Her eyes glistened, a flash of tears, but she blinked them away quickly, her gaze never leaving his. I didn't get the chance to fight back. You took that from me. You took my life, my chance to live. And for what? So you could get away with murder? Alex felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. The guilt, the crushing weight of it all, threatened to swallow him whole. He had never allowed himself to think about it, not for real. Not in the way Sophie was forcing him to know. But she was right. He had taken her life, stolen everything from her in a moment of fear, of panic, of selfishness. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said, his voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I didn't want to hurt you, Sophie. I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to?" Sophie interrupted, her voice rising. "You think that's enough? You think I can just forgive you because you didn't mean to? You killed me, Alex. You buried me like I was trash, and then you walked away. You moved on like it was nothing. But I never got to move on. I've been stuck in this hell for years, trying to piece together what happened to me, trying to survive when you left me for dead." The raw pain in her voice hit Alex like a physical blow. It felt like his ribs were cracking, like his chest was caving in. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. Sophie's words were like daggers, each one digging deeper, each one peeling away the last layer of defense he had left. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had betrayed, was standing here now, demanding to know why. "Why didn't you come back for me, Alex?" Sophie asked, her voice quiet now, almost pleading. "Why didn't you at least try to find me? I was alive. I was still alive, and you just left me there. Why?" Alex's eyes welled up with tears, but he quickly wiped them away. He couldn't cry. Not now. Not after everything he had done. "I didn't know what to do," he whispered again, his voice barely audible. "I was scared. I thought if I just buried you, if I just erased it all, I could move on. I could have a normal life again. I didn't want to face the truth. I didn't want to face what I'd done. But I didn't know what to do. I was lost, Sophie. I couldn't fix it." Sophie's eyes softened for just a moment, but the pain in them was still there, raw and unforgiving. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his arm. The touch felt like ice against his skin, like a reminder of the life he had stolen from her. "You didn't want to fix it?" she said softly. "You wanted to forget it. You wanted to forget me. But I never forgot you, Alex. I never forgot what you did." The room fell silent. The only sound was the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, the steady rhythm of the seconds slipping away. Sophie's gaze didn't leave him, and Alex could feel the weight of her stare, like 1,000 pounds pressing down on his chest. He couldn't move. He couldn't run. There was nowhere to hide anymore. "I've been through hell, Alex," Sophie continued, her voice steady now, but her eyes still burning with fury. "And I came back because I needed to know the truth. I needed to know why you did it. And I needed you to see what you've done. You don't get to just walk away from this. You don't get to erase me." "I'm sorry," Alex whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'm so sorry, but I can't take it back. I can't undo what I've done." Sophie nodded slowly, a bitter smile curving at the corners of her lips. "No, you can't, but you will face it now. You will face the consequences of your actions. You will face the life you tried to bury." The words cut through him, deeper than any knife. Alex wanted to scream, wanted to explain himself, but there was nothing left to say. Sophie wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't asking for answers. She wasn't even asking for an apology. She was asking for him to face the truth that had been buried for too long, the truth that had finally come to the surface. And Alex knew, deep down, that he had no choice but to face it. The knock on the door had come like a hammer, strike to his world. But now, as the police car pulled into his driveway, it felt like the ground was slipping out from under him. Piece by piece. Alex had expected many things: anger, questions, accusations, but not this. He never imagined it would escalate into something so real, so inescapable. The investigation, the cold, methodical digging into his life, was about to begin. And there was no way to stop it. Sophie had been silent for the last few minutes, her eyes still fixed on him with that unyielding gaze. But she had been waiting, Alex realized. Waiting for this moment, the moment when the truth would come rushing out. When she would force him to face the consequences of his actions. He had thought he could hide it forever. But now with the sirens wailing in the distance, with the flashing red and blue lights cutting through the calm of the suburban night. Alex knew he couldn't outrun it any longer. The door opened with a soft creak as two uniformed officers stepped. Inside, they didn't look surprised to see Sophie. In fact, they barely acknowledged her presence. Their eyes were fixed on Alex, their questions already forming behind their calm faces. "Mr. Matthews?" one of the officers asked, his voice professional, almost detached. "We need to ask you a few questions about your wife's disappearance and your current situation." Alex's throat went dry. His pulse quickened, thudding in his ears as he tried to maintain his composure. His hands were sweating, his knees felt weak, and his mouth was dry, but he couldn't show it. "Not yet. I'm not sure what you mean," Alex said, his voice hoarse. He forced a smile, though it felt like a lie already. He glanced at Sophie, who had remained eerily silent, watching him with cold eyes that pierced through him. She's not my wife anymore. We haven't been together in years." The officer nodded, taking a small notebook from his jacket pocket. "You're referring to the disappearance of your girlfriend, Sophie Wright, correct?" Alex stiffened at the mention of her name. It sounded wrong coming from someone else's lips. The truth that had been buried so long ago was now becoming a living, breathing thing suffocating him. Sophie was no longer a distant memory. She wasn't a haunting vision. She was real. And she was here, staring at him like she'd never left. "Yes?" Alex said, the word tasting foreign. "Sophie Wright, she disappeared years ago. His voice caught, but he forced himself to continue. "We thought she was gone. I thought she was gone." The officer didn't respond right away, just scribbling notes in his book. Alex's heart raced faster, a panic gnawing at the back of his mind. He could feel the walls closing in, and there was nowhere left to run. Sophie's presence in the room had already shifted everything, but now, with the police in his house, it felt like his world was collapsing on itself. "Can you explain why she's here now, Mr. Matthews?" the officer asked, his gaze unwavering. Alex opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck. He had rehearsed explanations in his head, countless times over the years, imagining the moment Sophie would return. But none of them felt right. He wasn't prepared for this. How could he be? "I don't know," Alex said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know she was alive. She showed up at my door. I don't know why. I'm not sure what she wants." The second officer, a woman, stepped forward, her eyes sharp as she assessed the situation. "You're telling us you had no contact with her before tonight? No indication she was alive?" Alex hesitated, trying to piece together the lies he had told so many times before. But this time, it felt different. The guilt was too heavy, the weight of the truth too much to bear. "No," he said, the words slipping from his lips like it wasn't his own. "I haven't heard from her. I thought she was gone. I thought ... she was dead." The woman officer nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She turned to Sophie, who had been standing motionless by the wall, her eyes never leaving Alex. "Ms. Wright," she said, "can you tell us what happened? What brought you here tonight?" Sophie's gaze flicked to Alex for a brief moment, and Alex felt his chest tighten. She had a look in her eyes now, a quiet determination that Alex had never seen before. It was as if she had made a decision long before she'd arrived, and now all she needed was for him to admit what he had done. "I'm not here to ask for revenge," Sophie said, her voice cold and steady. "I'm not here to destroy his life, but he needs to answer for what he did." Alex felt a chill run down his spine at her words. His breath caught in his throat. She wasn't asking for vengeance. She was asking for justice. And he knew, deep down, that no matter how hard he tried to hide, no matter how many lies he told, there was no escaping what he had done. Sophie turned back to the officers, her voice calm, but filled with an edge of authority. "I remember things now," she said, "bits and pieces, and I need him to explain. I need to know why he left me to die." Alex could feel his blood run cold. Sophie's words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper, exposing his deepest secret. The officers listened intently, their eyes flicking between Sophie and Alex. They were beginning to piece the story together, and Alex could feel the noose tightening. "You remember?" the officer asked, leaning forward slightly. "What do? You remember exactly?" Sophie glanced at Alex before continuing, her voice steady but filled with the quiet pain of everything she had been through. "I remember the argument. I remember him telling me I was ruining his life. I remember him shoving me." She paused, the air thick with the weight of her next words. "And I remember the dirt, the cold, the weight of it, the way he buried me, thinking I was dead." Alex's heart skipped a beat, his hands trembling at his sides. He wanted to scream. He wanted to deny everything. But he couldn't. Her words were true. He had buried her, left her to die, and now she was here, forcing him to confront the horror he had caused. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "You said you were buried alive. Can you tell us where that was? Do you remember anything about the location?" Sophie took a slow breath, her face tight with concentration. "I remember a tree," she said softly. "A curved tree near a broken fence. I remember the sound of water in the distance, and the way the ground felt under my fingers as I clawed my way out." The officers exchanged a look. Alex's chest tightened. He had buried her in the woods, but he had been careful. He had made sure no one would find her, but Sophie had found her way back. Her memories were coming back piece by piece, and every detail she revealed made Alex's heart race faster. The female officer glanced up at Alex, her eyes hard. "Is this true, Mr. Matthews? Did you bury her?" Alex opened his mouth, but no words came out. He couldn't lie anymore. The truth was there, hanging in the air like a fog. The lies he had built his life on were crumbling with each passing moment. The officer's voice was colder now, more calculated. "We're going to need to search the woods, Mr. Matthews. We have to know the truth." Alex could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. Sophie's eyes were locked on him now, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze. Something dark and knowing. She had already won. The investigation was no longer about whether she was alive or dead. It was about what Alex had done and how he could possibly explain away the buried truth. And as the police left to gather their search team, Alex knew there was no more running. The walls were closing in, and he couldn't hide anymore. The truth was coming for him, and there was nothing left to stop it. The walls were closing in, and Alex couldn't breathe. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the floor, his mind unraveling. The voices of the officers, Sophie's words, everything was coming at him too fast. He tried to concentrate, tried to piece together something that made sense, but it was slipping away from him, like sand through his fingers. He wasn't even sure when he had stopped thinking clearly. Maybe it was the moments Sophie had walked back into his life. Or maybe it had started long before that, when the first lie was told, and the second followed. His chest tightened, and his hands trembled. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white, the cold surface biting into his palms. His thoughts were racing, but nothing connected. He couldn't focus. He couldn't think. It's not happening. It's not real. He kept telling himself that, over and over, but the lie felt hollow now. Sophie was real. She was standing in front of him. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a nightmare. She was his past, and it had come crashing back in the worst way possible. Could feel his breath quicken. His heart was thudding in his chest, so loud it felt like it might explode. He had buried her. He had buried everything, but now it was all coming back. The investigation, the police, the truth, the truth. The truth was like a bomb, ticking down to zero, and Alex couldn't stop it. He could hear the soft murmur of the officers outside the door, a steady rhythm of their questions. He could feel their eyes on him, their quiet judgment, their suspicion. And Sophie's eyes, God, her eyes, they were unrelenting. They were watching him, dissecting him, as if she knew everything, as if she had already seen through him. He turned away from the counter, his head spinning. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to think, to plan, to figure out what came next, but nothing made sense anymore. The lies he had told, years of them, carefully woven into the fabric of his life, were unraveling before his eyes. The house that had once felt like a safe haven now felt like a prison. It's just a mistake, just a misunderstanding. I can talk. My way out of this. He clung to that thought, but deep down, he knew it wasn't true. There was no escaping it. The past was here, and it wasn't going anywhere. Sophie was here. The words echoed in his mind, relentless. He couldn't escape them. He couldn't escape her. I didn't mean for this to happen, he muttered under his breath. He wasn't sure who he was talking to anymore, Sophie, the officers, or himself. I didn't mean for any of this. But that was a lie too, wasn't it? He did mean it. He had meant it when he shoved her away, meant it when he made the decision to end her life, meant it when he buried her in the woods. It had been a choice. A desperate, selfish choice, but a choice. Nonetheless. And now he had to face the consequences. Alex ran a hand through his hair, tugging at the strands in frustration. His mind was a blur of chaos. Flashes of the night Sophie disappeared, fragments of his own fear and panic. The argument, her fall, the quiet stillness after. He had thought it was over. He had thought he could move on, that the world would forget her, and he could bury his past along with her body. But now, with Sophie standing in front of him, the truth was impossible to deny. The truth. Sophie's words rang in his head again, each one a reminder of the years he had spent pretending, running from what he had done. Why, Alex? Why didn't you come back for me? The question twisted in his chest, and the panic tightened its grip. His breath was shallow, coming in ragged bursts. His stomach churned with guilt and fear. The anger he had pushed down for years was now bubbling to the surface, and he couldn't contain it. His hands were shaking, his body trembling with a mix of guilt and helplessness. Stop it, Sophie, he whispered, the words strangled in his throat. Just stop. But Sophie didn't stop. She stood there, watching him, waiting for him to answer. And then she spoke again, her voice cold, unrelenting. You thought you could bury me. You thought you could erase me from your life. But I'm still here. And you have to face what you did? Alex's pulse was pounding in his ears. His vision blurred. He was drowning, suffocating under the weight of everything he had tried to forget. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke his spiraling thoughts. The officers were coming closer. The truth was coming for him, piece by piece, and there was no way to stop it. The door to the living room opened, and two officers walked in, their presence stark against the chaos that had overtaken Alex's mind. He turned to face them, his face pale, his breath still unsteady. His body was shaking now, the weight of everything pressing down on him like a vice. Mr. Matthews, the male officer said, his voice calm but firm. We're going to need you to come with us. Alex's stomach dropped. It was happening. It was all happening, and there was nothing left to do but face it. He could see the way the officers were looking at him now. Sophie had told her story. The investigation was no longer about finding answers. It was about finding him guilty. Double quotes. No. No, you don't understand, Alex stammered, his hands shaking as he stepped back. I didn't do it. I couldn't. The female officer stepped forward, her eyes hard, and Alex could see the determination in her gaze. You've been very cooperative, Mr. Matthews, but we've gathered enough evidence to charge you with homicide. You're under arrest. Alex's breath hitched. His body moved without his mind catching up. He stumbled backward, his legs buckling beneath him. No, no. You don't understand. Sophie, she's... His voice faltered, his words coming out in a broken mess. He couldn't finish. He couldn't explain that Sophie had watched him, standing silently as the officers moved in to cuff him. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, those eyes that had once been filled with love, now stared at him like a stranger. There was no anger there anymore, no hatred. Only the cold, unflinching stare of someone who had been through hell and survived. Alex didn't resist as they placed the cuffs around his wrists, but the weight of them felt heavier than he could have imagined. The reality of it, the finality of it sank in, and the world around him seemed to close off. He was walking into his own prison, a cage built from the lies he had told, the decisions he had made, and there was no way out. The officers led him outside, and the cool air hit him like a slap in the face. The flashing lights of the police car blurred in his vision, the world spinning around him in dizzying circles. The neighbors were watching now, peeking through their windows, their faces filled with disbelief. Alex had been the friendly neighbor, the man who mowed his lawn and waved from the driveway. But now, he was a criminal, a murderer, and the whole world would know. He was shoved into the back of the patrol car, the metal door slamming shut behind him with a finality that echoed. In his chest. Sophie stood on the front porch, watching him with those unblinking eyes. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just stood there, her presence solid, unyielding. And in that moment, Alex realized he was no longer in control. The life he had carefully built, the lies he had told to protect himself, were all gone. Sophie had returned, and with her, she had brought the truth. There was no more hiding, no more running. The past had caught up with him, and now there was no escaping the consequences of what he had done. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional rustle of paper and the steady tapping of the judge's gavel. The air felt thick, as if the weight of what had brought them all here was pressing down on the walls, making the room smaller and smaller with each passing moment. Alex sat at the defendant's table, his eyes staring straight ahead, not really seeing anything. He had been sitting there for days, his world reduced to the sterile, emotionless proceedings of the trial. The case had been straightforward, but the emotional toll of it was anything but simple. The evidence was overwhelming. Sophie's return, her testimony, the details of the burial site. The entire town had witnessed it. The media had flocked to the small courthouse, turning the quiet town into a circus of flashing cameras and speculation. Alex had become a public figure, but not in the way he'd once imagined. No longer the friendly neighbor, the man who helped with yard work, the man who smiled and waved at the school bus stop. Now, he was the monster in the story. The murderer. Sophie had taken the stand first, her voice steady as she described the horror of that night, the night Alex had shoved her, had buried her, had thought he'd left her for dead. She didn't raise her voice, didn't yell, but every word was filled with a quiet fury that reverberated in the silent courtroom. The same courtroom that had once been filled with whispers of her disappearance, whispers of the woman who had just vanished into thin air. Now, those whispers were replaced with gasps and shocked silence as the full truth of Alex's crime was laid bare. The defense team tried to discredit her testimony, claiming her memories were unreliable due to her head trauma. They had even gone so far as to suggest that her memories were fabricated, distorted by time and pain. But every word Sophie spoke rang with a terrifying clarity. She spoke about the argument, about the fear she'd felt, the pain of being shoved to the ground, and the cold terror of feeling the earth close over her. Alex had thought he could hide it. He had told himself for so many years that no one would ever know the truth, that he could bury his past along with Sophie's body. But there was no burying the truth. Sophie had come back, not to seek revenge, but to expose him for the man he truly was. Her words were the truth he could never escape. Now, Alex sat motionless, unable to look at her. He had been facing her for years, even though he'd never known it. She had haunted his every moment, every breath he took. But this time, her eyes were not filled with rage. They were filled with something else, a quiet, steady resolve. The trial continued, and Alex's defense grew weaker. His lawyer tried to argue that the prosecution lacked sufficient physical evidence, that there were gaps in the timeline, but it was futile. Sophie's testimony alone had sealed his fate. The burial site had been found, the evidence was irrefutable, and Alex's own words had betrayed him. His broken explanations, the moments of hesitation, the cracks in his defense, all painted the picture of a man who was guilty beyond any doubt. As the days dragged on, Alex felt himself slipping further into a pit of despair. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him like a 100-ton stone. He had tried to deny it for so long, but now in this small, suffocating courtroom, the truth was undeniable. The anger and frustration he had felt when Sophie first confronted him seemed so distant now, as if they had never been his emotions to begin with. All that remained was an emptiness that gnawed at his insides, a slow realization that his life was over. Then it was his turn. Alex stood shakily, facing the jury, the judge, and the gallery that was packed with curious onlookers, reporters, and even people from the town he had once lived in. He looked around the room, his gaze briefly landing on Sophie. She was sitting quietly in the front row, her eyes never leaving him. It was as if she was watching him, waiting for him to face the consequences. And in that moment, Alex realized there was no escape. There was no way out of this. His world was crumbling, and Sophie had been the one to make him face it. I didn't mean to hurt her, Alex said, his voice hoarse, his words tumbling out as if they had been locked inside him for years. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I just I didn't know. His defense attorney gave him a sympathetic look, but Alex didn't want sympathy. He didn't want to be pitied. He wanted to take it all back. He wanted to scream at the top of his lungs and beg for forgiveness. But he couldn't. He couldn't undo what he had done. The judge's voice cut through his thoughts, commanding, "Attention. Mr. Matthews, your actions have shown a complete disregard for human life. You have not only taken the life of an innocent person, but you have also tried to erase the truth. You have caused unimaginable pain, not only to the victim, but also to her family, her friends, and this community." Alex closed his eyes. The words felt like they were suffocating him. He had tried to escape them for so long, but now they were the only truth he knew. The prosecution's closing argument was short, but it didn't need to be long. The evidence spoke for itself. The crime was undeniable. The photos of the shallow grave, the buried tarp, the zip ties, and the remnants of Sophie's life that had been left behind in the woods. There was nothing to argue. No way to turn it around. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours, the weight of the evidence too much to ignore. When they returned, the room was still. Alex's heart thudded in his chest as the foreman stood, ready to deliver the verdict. The jury, find the defendant, Alex Matthews, guilty of second-degree murder, with an additional charge of tampering with evidence. The words hit Alex like a physical blow. His hands went cold, his body numb. The room around him began to fade, the faces of the jury, the reporters, even the judge, blurring in his mind. He could hear Sophie's steady breathing behind him, feel her gaze on his back like a weight. She had made him face it. She had made him confront what he had done. And now, the truth was finally, completely, out in the open. "Mr. Matthews," the judge continued, "you will be sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." The days following the verdict passed in a blur. Alex had been taken from the courthouse in handcuffs, his life falling apart with each step. Sophie's role in his downfall was undeniable. Her return had shattered the carefully constructed lie he had lived for so long. And though Alex had hoped for some sort of reprieve, some form of forgiveness, he knew it was impossible. The truth had caught up with him. There was no escaping the consequences now. As for Sophie, the moment she heard the verdict, she stood quietly in the back of the courtroom. She wasn't cheering. She wasn't angry. There were no tears, no outbursts. She had already cried enough. She had already felt enough. Sophie had come back not for vengeance, but for justice. And now, she had it. Her life had been taken from her, but now she was free. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor. And in that moment, she finally felt at peace.